Hello, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you're all doing super well. My name is Karan, and today we're going to be talking about motor neuron diseases. So it's a progressive degenerative condition of the motor nuclei of the spinal nerves. And what you need to know is that it has a relatively bad prognosis, which is about 27 months, a bit over 2 years. It affects speech, swallowing, and eventually breathing. So these are all muscle groups that are commonly affected. And as you know, breathing is controlled by the phrenic nerve, the roots of which are C3, C4, C5. And if you have the motor nuclei of those roots affected, then that would cause respiratory failure. And it usually affects males aged above the age of 50. Now, we have 4 different types, and to make this all a bit easier to understand, let's break it down. So when we talk about motor neurons, I'm sure you know that you have an upper motor neuron and you have a lower motor neuron. And that's going to be the case for every single tract we talk about. The 2 primary tracts responsible or relevant here are our corticospinal tract and our corticobulbar tract. Now, the corticospinal tract, as the name suggests, starts off in the cortexes or the motor cortex, goes all the way down to the spine, emerges and supplies the muscles of your entire body, except those of the head and face. Those are supplied by the corticobulbar tract. Now, you might be asking yourself, why is it called bulbar? So again, it follows kind of where the nerves are coming from and where they're going. So it rises from the cortex, cortico. Bulbar refers to the bulb, which is a term used to describe the brainstem as well as the cerebellum. So the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum together are often called the bulb. And you need to know that, I'm sure if you've attended our previous lectures on strokes and brainstem strokes, you would remember that applying our rule of 4s, our cranial nerves 9, 10, and 12, which are all motor or have motor components, arise from that bulb, which is why it's called corticobulbar. So when I'll be talking about the corticobulbar tract, I'll be talking about the motor nuclei of cranial nerves 9, 10, and 12. Those would be controlling, namely, movements of the tongue, movements of the mouth, as well as movements of the pharynx. So speech, lip movements, tongue movements, all would be controlled by the corticobulbar tract. So let's start off with the most important, the biggest, and the most common motor neuron disease. I shouldn't say most important because all of them are important, but we have amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS. And this is the ALS Ice Bucket Challenge that was a huge deal a few years ago, if you remember that. So it's the commonest. It affects both the upper and lower motor neurons of both the tracts. So it affects all 4. The way I like to think about it, we have 4 different tracts. We have 4 different bunch of motor neurons. We have the broadly split into 2 corticobulbar, corticospinal, and each one of them have upper motor and lower motor neurons. So overall, we have 4 tracts, 2 upper motor, 2 lower motor, right? AML affects all 4 of them. As you can imagine, that's going to have the worst prognosis. We then have primary lateral sclerosis that affects the upper motor of both the tracts. It doesn't affect the lower motor neurons. Why is it called primary lateral? We'll talk about that in a second. We then have progressive bulbar palsy, and as the name suggests, it's bulbar, so it's going to affect the corticobulbar tract, and it affects the lower motor neurons of the corticobulbar tract. And this is often called a pseudobulbar palsy. Lastly, we have progressive muscular atrophy, which affects lower motor neurons of the corticospinal tract. As the name suggests, muscular atrophy is typically a lower motor sign, right? And that's why we have your lower motor neurons being affected. The reason we get these diseases, the etiology is quite unknown, but it's considered to be hereditary. We have an issue with the folding of proteins that leads to the accumulation of faulty proteins in the spinal tract. And over time, these accumulate and cause local destruction within these tracts. So let's start off with ALS. It's also called Lou Gehrig's disease, and this commonly comes up on exam questions. So remember, ALS is just your Lou Gehrig's disease. And it affects both the upper and lower motor neurons of both the corticospinal as well as the corticobulbar tract. I haven't mentioned that here. I probably should have. Because it can attack both the anterior horn as well as the corticospinal tract. So basically, because it can affect all the tracts, it can present with either upper motor signs or lower motor signs. So whenever you have a question where you have these vague neurological symptoms, so a typical presentation would be patient comes in with hyperreflexia at the knee, but they have some hypotonus in the left upper limb and weakness, and they have some weird tongue fasciculations. That makes me think ALS because everything's being affected, right? We have lower motor, we have upper motor, we have bulbar involvement, that's ALS. And there is no sensory involvement, and that distinguishes it from syringomyelia. Now, what is primary lateral sclerosis? So it refers to the progressive degeneration of upper motor neurons in both the tracts, so both the corticospinal and the corticobulbar tract. It's called lateral because these upper motor neurons typically reside in the lateral segments of the spinal cord. So if you have a cross-section, you would see that they usually are lateral tracts. How would this present? So let's go by each tract. So upper motor neuron lesions of the corticospinal tract, which supplies most of your body, is going to present with hyperreflexia, clonus, hypertonus, and spasticity. While upper motor neuron lesions of the corticobulbar tract, and this is called pseudobulbar palsy. The reason it's called pseudobulbar is because it is not really affecting the lower motor neurons. So when we talk about bulbar palsies, that typically involves lower motor neurons. This is affecting similar parts of the body. So your jaw, your tongue, your larynx, but it is an upper motor neuron lesion, which is why it's called pseudobulbar palsy. Pseudobulbar palsies are also typically seen in other conditions that affect upper motor neurons of the bulbar tract. And this includes things like compressive tumors and strokes. And when I say, obviously, corticobulbar tract, I'm referring specifically to the tracts of cranial nerve 9, 10, 12. And this presents with dysphagia, dysarthria, as well as jaw hypertonus. Now talking about progressive bulbar palsy. Now remember, that was pseudobulbar. This is bulbar, which means it's going to be affecting the lower motor neurons purely of the corticobulbar tract. And that's going to present with similar things, so dysphagia, dysarthria, but also wasting and fasciculation of the tongues. Now, what I want you to know is that these conditions and these diagnoses are very, very clinical, right? There's no single protein test you can do that tells you, oh, this is ALS versus this is progressive bulbar palsy. You very commonly could have a case where a patient presents with just this. So they have dysphagia, dysarthria, wasting. A neurologist might think this is PBP or progressive bulbar palsy, makes that diagnosis, and then they present with weakness in the lower limbs. Well, that changes a lot of things because now we know that the bulbar tract is not the only one being affected. We also have some corticospinal involvement, and that would change the diagnosis to ALS because it's the only one that affects the two tracts like that. Also, the rate of onset of these symptoms is going to be much quicker than that's seen in ALS, sorry, not AML, ALS, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis. So even with ALS, you can have these symptoms, but these symptoms in PBP usually set in much quicker than if they were to happen with ALS. But that's a very small distinction that I don't think is very relevant, clinically at least, to your level. And then we have progressive muscular atrophy. So how is that going to present? So you have atrophy of the muscles, and that's typically going to present with lower motor neuron signs, right? So we know that we have the lower motor neurons being affected, and that's going to present with weakness, wasting, hyporeflexia, and hypotonus. Relatively straightforward. Now, when it comes to investigations, unless you are the neurologist, it's very unlikely you're going to be making these diagnoses. But before you get them onto that level, you want to perform some tests to rule out or rule in certain other conditions. So investigations that are important include EMGs or electromyography, and this is often where we test a muscle's response to an electric stimulus. We can also do nerve conduction tests to see if the actual transmission of the nervous impulse within a nerve is slowed or not. We can also do neuroimaging, which would be a CT or an MRI, to distinguish other conditions like MS that could potentially present in a similar way. As far as treatment options are concerned, they're quite sparse. As I mentioned, the average survival after diagnosis is only 27 months. We have 2 current medications that have been shown to have minor benefits when it comes to life expectancy. These are called Relaxol and Edravone. I think I mispronounced that, but that's okay. And Riluzole, the way to remember it is it has Leu in it, and Riluzone helps treat Lou Gehrig's disease. It's a bit of a stretch, but I hope that helps. And I think that's all we had on our motor neuron diseases. I hope that helped. If you guys have any questions, please feel free to get in touch on my email or through Facebook. And as always, please look after yourself and please look after your loved ones.